Hi, my name is Jeremiah Tremblay, and my paper and oral presentation is on The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. The point of the story is relatively simple and self-explanatory, as the title says. It's about a group of soldiers during Vietnam War time, and it discusses what kind of things they carry. They carry physical things like ammo, food, weapons, raincoats, but we also learn about the emotional burdens that they carry. And those burdens are the main point of the story. So take this quote from page 1160. Grief, war, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles, but the tangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. Obviously, it's saying that the emotions they carried with them weighed just as much, if not more, than the tangible ones. So it appears that the soldiers also display signs of depersonalization disorder, which is described by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as one feeling like they are watching a film of their own life or they're outside of their body. The author of the story himself, Mr. O'Brien, may have had post-traumatic stress disorder, which is different from depersonalization disorder, and PTSD is probably the most common disorder that we associate with soldiers and with wartime. He was quoted as saying, "One of the ways to deal with trauma is to be traumatized. I worry that there's not enough trauma. We heal too quickly, too easily, and too smoothly. I think you're nuts if you come back from what I went through and you aren't nuts. If you don't have anger issues, I think you're crazy. I think you're not human." Not only are they battling the ever-present enemy, but they are also battling their own desire to flee from the danger and seek out someplace safe. Now, probably the biggest struggle is trying to avoid feeling dishonored or embarrassed. To them, this would be worse than death. Many of them fight because that's not what they believe in, but because that's what they feel they have to do. They don't want to be scorned for not fighting or for appearing cowardly. Tim O'Brien himself talked about his own fears about fighting. He said in an interview, "There were many volunteers, of course, that went to Vietnam, but the bulk of us were draftees who probably more or less went reluctantly. I went to war kicking and screaming. I was terrified of dying." The thing that is focused on most in the story is Lieutenant Cross's unresolved love for a girl that is back in his hometown named Martha. And ultimately, this love ends up having disastrous consequences for the group. We see that Cross often slips into a kind of fantasy or daydream world where he imagines himself with Martha. At one point, he sees them walking on a beach together, and in another, he thinks back to the time they had their first date. This happens during down, quiet times, such as night, as well as tense times, like when one of the soldiers is in a tunnel and the rest of the platoon is waiting to see if he makes it out alive. All of them have their own little fantasy of being picked up in planes and flying home, away from the war and not having to worry anymore. Mentally transporting oneself to another place or time is a common coping mechanism to deal with high-stress times, according to the DSM. The story comes to a head when, in the midst of one of Cross's daydreams, Ted Lavender is shot down and dies instantly. This has a profound effect on Cross, and he takes it personally. On page 1158, "He felt shame. He hated himself. He had loved Martha more than his men, and as a consequence, Lavender was dead, and this was something he would have to carry like a stone in his stomach for the rest of the war." As evidence from that quote, Cross blames himself for the death and digs a ditch in an emotional tirade. After he digs it, he begins to sob as his fellow soldiers listen on from afar. In addition to his already heavy emotional baggage, he now adds guilt, shame, and a kind of hate or disdain for Martha. Finally, he realizes that his daydreams have gotten out of control, and soon after, he burns the pictures and photos of Martha that he carried with him. He pushes Martha out of his head and vows to eliminate the daydreams. As he thinks this, he sees a vision of Martha in the air. And although he wants to acknowledge her, he doesn't. This is the last thought of Martha that he has in this story. He knows that he must focus on his troops now, and he's going to be harsher on them now. Page 1163 says, he would not tolerate laxity. He would show strength, distancing himself. So, even though he has retired the burden of Martha, he has also picked up new ones, namely, guilt over Lavender's death. Long after he is freed of his physical burdens, the guilt will remain. In a video interview in 2010, the last question of the interview with Tim O'Brien was, what things does he carry himself? And he had this great quote, and I just want to read it to you to close out the presentation. What do I carry? I carry a delight in doing what I do, and a belief in doing what I do, along with a sadness. 2 decades later, I'm fielding questions about war that I fielded all those years ago. It's sort of back where we were and then some. That feels like a tangible burden. But I carry with me those 2 kids, his children, that I mentioned, and even though they are not physically here, they're all around me and the person I become. And I carry a slight but palpable feeling of obligation to do justice to the savagery I witnessed, and the senselessness of it and the sadness of it. To do justice to the ghosts of the dead Vietnamese and the dead Americans, and especially their mothers and dads who are still bearing the burden, even though their kids are long dead. And that's a pretty solemn obligation. Well, that's it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.